The CEO sat at his desk, staring blankly at the image of his face on the cover of Time magazine. The bright, glossy print screamed success, yet his heart felt like it was sinking. There was a chill in the room, the stark contrast between his success and his loneliness painfully obvious. A massive empire sat at his fingertips, yet all he could think about was the child staring back at him from across the courtroom. Handcuffed. Desperate. It was a paradox he couldn't escape, and no matter how many walls he built, this moment would haunt him forever. His empire was perfect, but his life wasn't. He built an empire, but he couldn't save her. The voice echoed in his mind, ringing louder with every passing second. He wiped his tears and stared at the file on his desk, a child's future, tangled in a game that had no winners. In the courtroom, the judge called for silence, but the air was thick with tension. The child was called to the stand, trembling as he slowly stood up. His small hands gripped the edges of the chair for support. His mother sat nearby, her face hidden in her hands, unable to look. This was a battle for her son's future, and she had nothing left to give. The CEO, now a ghost in the courtroom, realized the weight of his decisions. He had built empires, conquered markets, yet he couldn't fix this broken family. His empire of success seemed meaningless in this room of desperation and sorrow. The child's future was teetering on the edge, and he felt helpless, unable to undo the damage. This was the moment everything changed. The CEO couldn't help but wonder if his fortune was just an illusion. As the trial drags on, the CEO begins to lose track of time. His thoughts swirl back to his early days, the nights spent building his company, the sacrifices, the people he left behind. He'd thought that success would fill the void, but now all he saw was a fractured family and a child left to fend for himself. Was this the price of greatness? The feeling of power, of control, had only isolated him more. The faces of his employees, once loyal, had become distant. His family had grown apart, and now, the one life he couldn't save was right in front of him. He realized that no amount of money could undo the pain that had been caused, and the guilt weighed on him like 1,000 bricks. He had built everything, but in the process, he had lost the most important thing. The trial concluded with a somber verdict. The child was taken from his mother and placed in the custody of the state. The room fell silent. The CEO stood, not knowing what to do next. The weight of his decision had crushed him, but it wasn't just the court's ruling that affected him. It was the realization that he could never undo the damage he had done. The empire he had built seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the broken family, the child who would never know the man who had the power to help him. His steps echoed in the cold, empty hallway, each one carrying him further from the life he had known. In that moment, he realized that power wasn't the answer. It had never been. Alone in his office that night, the CEO stared at the file on his desk once more. The child's photo seemed to stare back at him, accusing him silently. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, but none of it mattered. His empire, his wealth, his success, none of it felt like anything anymore. The only thing that remained was the feeling of guilt that gnawed at him from the inside out. How had it all gone so wrong? Could he have done something differently? But in the silence of the night, there were no answers, only the weight of his choices. He finally stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city he had conquered, wondering if any of it had ever truly mattered. The story wasn't always about empires and stock prices. Once it was about a child with big dreams, dreams that would one day shatter under the weight of a failing parent. The boy, now a young man, sat in the back of a classroom, his eyes filled with determination. He swore to never be like his father, to never let business or money take the place of what really mattered: family, love, and loyalty. His mother's tear-streaked face, pleading for a chance at a better life, haunted him. He had seen his father rise to unimaginable heights, but the price was always too steep. At an early age, he learned that success could be suffocating. His mind was set. He wouldn't repeat his father's mistakes. The road ahead seemed clear, but life, as always, had its own plans. His heart was a battlefield between ambition and the fear of losing everything he loved. As the years passed, the young man grew into the role he had sworn to avoid. He started his own business, trying to stay true to his promise. But ambition had a way of creeping in. Late nights, endless phone calls, and cold meetings replaced his time with loved ones. He was becoming his father in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't the money that consumed him, but the fear of failure, the fear that his mother's sacrifices would be in vain. He had taken on a partner, an older mentor who showed him the ropes, helped him avoid the traps his father had fallen into. But there were whispers in the company, whispers that felt too close to the truth. The same fear that had once gripped his father's heart now began to gnaw at his own. Had he become a prisoner of the same ambition? Could he escape it before it was too late? He couldn't keep running forever. The business had grown rapidly, faster than he had anticipated. But the more success he found, the more he realized he was losing sight of what truly mattered. His mother had passed years ago, her dreams unfulfilled. His father was a distant figure, now a shadow of the man who had built an empire. He couldn't help but wonder, had his father felt the same loneliness when the world praised him for his achievements? Was it possible to rise above the ashes of a broken family, without becoming broken yourself? The young man stood on the edge of his own empire, watching it grow larger and larger, but the emptiness inside him only deepened. The more he achieved, the more he felt like he was losing. Was it worth it? Was it ever worth it? One night, a phone call changed everything. His mentor, the man who had guided him, had been found dead. An accident, they said. The young man's world shattered. This wasn't just the loss of a business partner. It was a betrayal of everything he had built. His mentor had promised him a different path, one that didn't rely on the same cutthroat tactics that had made his father infamous. But the sudden death opened his eyes to something darker. The business world was unforgiving, and the truth was hard to swallow. The young man stared at the funeral notice in his hands, unable to make sense of it. Had his mentor been hiding something? Or was this just the inevitable end for anyone who tried to escape the cycle of ambition? The walls around him seemed to close in, and the weight of the choices he had made pressed down harder than ever before. In the days that followed, the young man's world began to crumble. The whispers in the company grew louder. He had always tried to do things differently, but the allure of power was too strong. His mentor's death had left a void, and now he was beginning to understand just how far his mentor had been willing to go to succeed. The temptation to take shortcuts, to follow the path of least resistance, felt more real than ever before. The young man wrestled with his choices. Could he take the reins of the company, knowing that it might destroy the ideals he had fought so hard to uphold? He was at a crossroads. He could either remain true to his vision or succumb to the same darkness that had consumed his father. The battle was no longer external, it was within himself. The young man's business began to take off, faster than he ever imagined. It was a whirlwind of late nights, endless meetings, and constant pressure. But with every victory came the cost. His relationships, his health, his sense of self. His friends began to fade into the background, their faces replaced by new, faceless business partners. The person he was becoming didn't feel like the person he had promised to be. Yet each deal, each acquisition, felt like the validation he craved. His company was growing, his influence expanding. But the more he climbed, the more he realized that every step upward pulled him further from the life he had envisioned. He told himself it was worth it, that this success would make everything right. But deep down, he wondered if it was already too late to turn back. Success was slipping through his fingers, and all he had were moments of fleeting triumph. The more he achieved, the more the price became apparent. He missed his sister's wedding. He forgot his best friend's birthday. The loneliness began to creep in, taking root in the quiet moments between conference calls. He felt like an outsider in his own life, disconnected from the people who once meant everything to him. Even his father, the man whose empire he had once despised, seemed like a distant memory. He tried to call his mother's old friends for advice, but the words didn't come. His body was exhausted, his mind overstimulated, and his soul, the one thing he had once cherished, was slowly eroding. Success had become a ghost he couldn't outrun, and as the weight of his choices pressed down on him, he wondered, was this all there was? Was this the price of greatness? His eyes darted to his phone, flooded with messages and emails, yet his heart felt empty, knowing that none of them mattered. One morning, as the weight of exhaustion overtook him, he collapsed in his office. For the first time, he realized he couldn't go on like this. His body had betrayed him, and his mind was clouded with the noise of a million decisions he had made. It had been years since he had allowed himself to stop and think, but now, all he could do was sit in the silence. He stared at the walls of his office, once filled with ambition and energy, now empty and sterile. There were no answers, no simple solutions. Just questions he had buried beneath his drive. Had he built something real, or was it all just a construct of numbers and expectations? His phone buzzed, a reminder of another meeting, but he ignored it. The world outside his office continued to spin, but inside he was still. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe, to feel the weight of what he had lost, and what he had yet to gain. The silence was broken by a knock on the door. His assistant entered, holding a thick file. She was a reminder of everything he had built, the team that now relied on him, the empire he had created. She handed him the file detailing another lucrative opportunity, another step toward further growth. But as he glanced at the numbers, he felt no excitement. He felt nothing. The weight of the decisions he had made, pushing forward at all costs, abandoning everything he had once held dear, was too much to bear. He set the file down on the desk without a word. She didn't ask questions. She knew better than to pry. But inside he wondered if he could continue down this path. He had sacrificed so much for this empire, but what was left to give? He had become a prisoner to his own success, and the truth was undeniable. He was losing himself. The question now wasn't whether he could survive. It was whether he still wanted to. Weeks passed, and the young man found himself standing at the edge of the very empire he had built. The office was still full of life, bustling with employees and deals being signed. But he felt detached, like an observer in his own life. He had everything, money, power, recognition, but none of it mattered. His body, exhausted from years of pressure, began to betray him. His mind, once sharp, was now clouded with doubt. He wondered if he could escape the grip of ambition, if he could reclaim the life he had lost. But with every new success came the fear that he was sinking deeper into the same hole that had consumed his father. The battle had become internal. He was fighting not just for success, but for his own soul. He had to decide, was he willing to keep sacrificing everything for something that no longer felt real? The night of the meeting, the young man felt a heavy unease, an unshakable feeling that something was wrong. The room was filled with tension as the board members gathered, the stakes higher than ever before. But as the meeting began, it didn't take long for the truth to surface. His co-founder, the one person he had trusted above all else, stood up and revealed something that would change everything. The company wasn't entirely his. The business they had built together wasn't just his achievement. It was a joint effort with his sibling. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. All the late nights, all the sacrifices, were based on a lie. His father's empire, his legacy, was never truly his alone. The walls closed in on him as he realized that the foundation of everything he had worked for was built on secrets and deception. The truth was clear now. He had never truly been in control. The world seemed to spin around him as the truth about his co-founder sank in. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of a life he thought he knew. His sibling had been there all along, hidden in the background, pulling strings, shaping the company without his knowledge. It wasn't just a betrayal of business. It was a betrayal of everything he had worked for. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night. The weight of the revelation was crushing. His empire, the one he had thought was solely his, was a lie. His sibling had watched from the shadows, quietly claiming a stake in the business they had built together. The young man felt his world unraveling in real time. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. This was personal. The trust he had placed in the wrong person had cost him everything. The tension in the room was unbearable as the co-founder explained the details of the deception. The company's true ownership, the stakes, the hidden deals, everything was laid bare, piece by piece. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about control. His sibling had always been there, quietly manipulating the situation, setting the stage for a moment just like this one. The young man felt a rage build inside him, but it wasn't just the anger of betrayal. It was the anger of realizing that he had been complicit in his own downfall. The company, the empire he had built, had been in the hands of someone else all along. His world was crumbling, and the future that he had worked so hard for now seemed uncertain. What was the point of all his sacrifices, if it had never truly been his? His voice trembled as he asked the question no one had the answer to. What happens now? The meeting ended abruptly, and the young man was left alone in the room with the echoes of what had just transpired. His empire, the dream he had built, was now a shadow of itself. As he sat in the silence, he realized that nothing could ever be the same again. His entire understanding of the company, his place in it, had been a lie. The anger that had bubbled up inside him now gave way to a deep sense of loss. His father had warned him about the dangers of ambition, but he never truly understood until now. He had spent years building something he thought was his, but in the end it was never about him at all. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was a call from his mentor's old business partner, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. His voice trembled as he picked up the phone, unsure of what to expect. The phone call was brief, but revealing. His mentor's business partner had known about the co-founder's hidden involvement for years, and now, the entire truth was coming to light. The mentor, who had once been his guiding star, had kept the secret, perhaps for his own reasons, perhaps out of loyalty to the sibling. The young man hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the decisions he had made, the paths he had taken, all seemed meaningless now. Everything he had thought was true. Everything he had worked for was a carefully crafted illusion. As he stood up and walked to the window, he felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just from his co-founder, but from the very world he had built. The city outside looked the same, but he felt like a stranger in it. The price of his ambition had been much higher than he ever realized, and now the question remained: what was left to fight for? The final board meeting loomed, and the young man knew that this moment would define everything. The empire he had built, the legacy of his father, the dreams of his past, all of it was on the line. The decision was clear: either sell the company and secure his financial future, or take a monumental risk and fight to regain control of his destiny. The weight of his past choices pressed down on him. He had already sacrificed so much, but could he sacrifice more? The room was filled with the murmurs of board members, all eager for the final decision. As he stood before them, the realization hit him: this wasn't just a business decision, this was about his soul. What kind of man would he become if he sold out? Could he live with himself if he let everything go? With a trembling hand, he reached for the gavel, the moment of truth just an inch away. This was it. There was no going back. The room fell into complete silence as the young man lifted the gavel, his gaze steady, unblinking. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for the inevitable. But then, something shifted. The anger, the frustration, the fear, they all began to melt away. He had spent years fighting for control, for validation, for success. But now, in this moment, he realized that all of it, everything he had worked for, was meaningless without his integrity. He could not betray the man he had promised to be. With a deep breath, he slammed the gavel down, signaling his decision. The room erupted into murmurs, but his decision was final. He was no longer just fighting for power. He was fighting for his own sense of self. And as he looked around the room, he knew that this was a decision he could live with, even if it meant losing everything. The decision had been made, but the battle was far from over. As the board members filed out, whispers filled the room. Some were supportive, others furious. The young man remained at the table, his hands still trembling, but his heart finally at ease. The world he had built was on the brink of collapse, but for the first time in years, he felt like himself again. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. It was quiet, peaceful, as though the world was holding its breath. The skyline stretched before him, a symbol of everything he had built and everything he had yet to lose. In that moment, he realized that the true value of success wasn't in the buildings, the deals, or the power. It was in the choices he made, the man he chose to be. No matter what happened next, he would never compromise that again. The next few days were a blur. The media stormed the company, the headlines filled with rumors and speculation. But in the midst of it all, something remarkable happened. The people around him, his employees, his friends, began to rally. They saw the decision for what it was, an act of courage, not weakness. It wasn't about the money or the empire. It was about integrity. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild what had been lost, brick by brick. There were still challenges ahead, but the foundation was stronger now, built not on greed, but on honesty and hard work. As he walked through the office, his team greeted him with respect and admiration. He had made the right choice, not just for the company, but for himself. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be his own. In the end, the empire he had feared losing became something far greater. It was no longer about power or prestige. It was about building a company and a life that reflected who he truly was. As he sat in his office late one evening, the skyline before him, he thought back to everything that had brought him to this point. The sacrifices, the heartache, the betrayals, it had all led him here, to this moment of peace. He wasn't the man he had been, nor the man he had once hoped to be. He was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned that true success wasn't measured by the things you accumulate, but by the person you become along the way. As he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, he knew that he had finally found his way home. It had been a year since the board meeting that changed everything. The company, once on the brink of collapse, was now stabilizing. The young man had found his rhythm again, but it was different this time. The constant pressure was gone. He had rebuilt his team, his relationships, and most importantly, himself. Yet, something was still missing. He walked through the office, noting the changes, new faces, new ideas, but there was an emptiness that lingered. The sacrifices had been great, and the journey long, but in the quiet moments, he couldn't help but wonder if he had paid too high a price. His heart was heavier now, burdened with the knowledge that he had lost so much along the way. As he sat at his desk, the reality of what he had become settled in. He was no longer the man who set out to conquer the world. He was someone different now, someone who had learned the hard way that success and happiness don't always come hand in hand. As he sat in his office late one evening, a sense of quiet finally settled over him. The chaos of the past few years had faded, and now, the business was in a steady rhythm. He thought back to the moments of doubt, the times when he had felt trapped by his own ambition, and wondered if it had all been worth it. The friends he had lost, the relationships he had neglected, they were still there, in the back of his mind. He had rebuilt the empire, but at what cost? He wondered if his father, had he been alive, would have understood. The business world was a tough one, but there were moments when he longed for simpler times. The world outside the window was still, calm, but inside, his heart was conflicted. There was no perfect answer, no right or wrong. Just the path he had chosen, for better or worse. Months later, he visited his father's grave. The weight of the past few years seemed lighter as he stood there, the cool breeze of the evening gently brushing against him. It was a quiet moment, one of reflection. His father had been a man of ambition, a man who built an empire but sacrificed everything in the process. The young man had often resented that, but now, standing in the presence of his father's legacy, he understood. His father's mistakes had been his own, and now his own mistakes were his to own. As he stood there, he realized that he wasn't just living for himself anymore. He had come full circle, understanding that his father's journey had shaped his own. The pain was still there, but it had softened. He wasn't free of the past, but he had learned to carry it with him, to make peace with it. With time, the young man found balance. His company flourished, but so did his personal life. He reconnected with old friends, spent time with family, and rediscovered a sense of joy he had once forgotten. The pursuit of success was no longer an obsession. It was a part of the whole. He understood now that success, in its truest sense, wasn't about reaching the top. It was about finding contentment in the journey, in the moments along the way. He had learned to slow down, to savor the small victories, and to be present in his own life. His business continued to grow, but now it was a tool for fulfillment, not the end goal. It wasn't perfect. Life rarely was, but it was real. And that was enough. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by the accomplishments he had achieved, he knew that the journey ahead was his to shape. One evening, he stood on the balcony of his office, looking out at the skyline. The city had changed, and so had he. He had learned that there was no finish line in life, no ultimate goal to reach. Success wasn't something you could possess. It was a journey of understanding, of growth, of finding meaning in the moments that mattered. His past, full of mistakes and triumphs, was a part of who he had become, but it no longer defined him. The world outside his window was vast, full of possibility, and he was ready for whatever came next. It was a feeling of peace, of acceptance. He had no illusions left. The weight of the past was lighter, and the future, whatever it held, was his to embrace. With a deep breath, he stepped back inside, ready to continue the journey, not as the man he once was, but as the man he had become. Years passed, and the company continued to thrive, but the young man, now older, wiser, no longer saw it as the center of his universe. He had built it, fought for it, and watched it grow, but it was no longer who he was. His life had taken on new meaning, a quiet weekend with family, a chance to be present with his loved ones. He had learned that nothing could replace the time spent with those who mattered most. And though his achievements were numerous, there were moments when he felt like he had lost something in the pursuit of them. His legacy was not only written in the company's name, but also in the way he had learned to truly live. But even as he stood on the precipice of a new chapter, he was still haunted by the one question that had always lingered in the back of his mind. Had he done enough to make it right? One evening, he found himself alone in the company's old office, the place where it all began. The once bustling room was now quiet, the echoes of past decisions and struggles fading into the walls. The young man sat at his old desk, his fingers tracing the surface of the polished wood. This was where he had dreamed, planned, and fought for everything he had built. But now, in this quiet moment, the office felt empty. The empire, the legacy, it was all real, but it was also a chapter he was ready to close. It was time to step away, to let someone else carry the torch forward. And though the thought was bittersweet, he knew it was the right decision. It was time to pass the mantle on, to find peace with what he had achieved, and to let go of the weight of what he had once believed to be everything. Later that evening, he found himself standing in front of the company's building, looking up at the towering structure. It was a symbol of everything he had accomplished, but it was also a symbol of everything he had learned to let go of. The city lights flickered in the background as a child's laughter echoed from a nearby park. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the sounds of life wash over him. The company had been his life, his obsession, but it had never been the only thing that mattered. He realized now that the things he had once sacrificed, his family, his peace of mind, were far more precious than anything he had ever achieved. The weight of that realization was heavy, but it was also liberating. As he turned to leave, he knew that the chapter was truly over, but a new one was just beginning. As he entered his home, he was greeted by his family, his daughter running up to him with a smile. The moment was simple, but it was everything. In his arms, he held not just the weight of his achievements, but the love and warmth of the people who had stood by him all these years. He thought about the years he had spent chasing success, the sacrifices made, and the personal cost of his ambition. But in this moment, surrounded by family, he understood what it all had been for. It wasn't the boardrooms, the numbers, or the accolades. It was this, being present, being real, being home. His daughter's laughter filled the room, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. The empire he had built would continue without him, but the legacy he had created, the family he had fought for, was his true victory. The years had passed, and though the young man's name still appeared in the headlines, it was no longer the name that defined him. It was the man he had become. He had left the company, the empire he had once thought was everything. But he had never left her. As he stood by the window of his home, watching the fireworks light up the night sky, he thought about everything he had built, and everything he had given up. The empire was still there, still alive, but his heart no longer resided in its walls. His heart was with his family, with the future they would build together. As he turned away from the window and toward his daughter who stood beside him, he realized that in the end, it was love that had given him everything he truly needed. The legacy he had wanted to create wasn't about power or wealth. It was about the people he loved, and the life they would share.